Often when you talk about the greatest fighter of all time, the likes of Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Robinson, and in recent years, Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather are often thrown around. But one name you very rarely hear mentioned is Henry Armstrong, the man Teddy Atlas claims is the greatest boxer to ever live. And personally, I have Armstrong number 2 of all time, solely behind the greatest fighter to ever live in Sugar Ray Robinson. Armstrong's achievements are so underrated and never spoken about that sadly, he's become one of boxing's forgotten all-time great warriors. Yet, there's been no one that's dominated across so many different weight classes with such brutal consistency as Hammerin' Hank did. The man history knows as Homicide Hank left one of the most incredible legacies ever seen that's sadly been widely forgotten. But today, I'm going to tell you why Henry Armstrong may well be the greatest boxer that's ever lived. If you look at Armstrong at the beginning of his career, there's really nothing to go off to suggest that he was going to become one of the greatest fighters ever. His early form, to put it quite frankly, was pretty terrible. He was stopped in 3 rounds in his debut and lost 4 of his first 5 fights. But having worked the railroads, often malnourished when he was fighting, Armstrong had seen the Cuban great Kid Chocolate and was inspired to become a professional boxer. The 5'5" featherweight suffered the majority of his defeats early on in his career, having either lost or drawn 17 of his first 60 fights. But after his 60th fight, something clicked, and he went on what I consider to be the greatest prime the sport's ever seen, bar none, completely defying the logic of weight divisions with a knockout efficiency no one's ever been able to mimic. In 1936, the 26-year-old Armstrong finally scored a victory against one of his great rivals, Hall of Fame Mexican Baby Arizmendi, who had outpointed Armstrong earlier in his career. This was a major turning point, and it was backed by a knockout defeat against world champion Juan Zarita. A disqualification loss to Tony Chavez would be the last defeat in Armstrong's incredible prime years. On his warpath to the featherweight title, Armstrong KO'd 2 Hall of Famers, each in the 4th round, in Frankie Click and Benny Bass, and in 1937 defeated the Hall of Fame champion P.T. Cerrone via knockout to become the featherweight champion of the world. These 3 Hall of Fame victories were all part of a 27-fight successive knockout streak Armstrong compiled across a year's work. In 1937 alone, he went 27 fights, 27 wins, and scored a staggering 26 knockouts. Another Hall of Famer in Chalky Wright was also knocked out within that 27 knockout streak, until Baby Arizmendi was defeated again over points, taking Armstrong the 10-round distance. Having conquered the featherweight division, Armstrong then jumped all the way up to welterweight, which in modern context is the equivalent of a 5-division jump in one go, to take on one of the greatest fighters to ever live, Barney Ross. To this day, I still regard Barney Ross as a top 20 all-time great fighter. His resume is absolutely off the charts, with wins over the likes of Tony Canzonieri, Jimmy McClarnin, Seferino Garcia, Izzy Gennazo, and so many great fighters. Ross was one of the first fighters to ever become a 3-division champion and suffered just 4 defeats in an 80-fight career. It was the likes of Barney Ross, Jimmy McClarnin, Tony Canzonieri and many others that made the 1930s the era of the great lightweights. And whilst Ross was the welterweight champion of the world, and Armstrong, in an incredible run of form, went up to challenge Ross for the welterweight title. Ultimately, Armstrong slaughtered Ross for 11 rounds. Due to Ross being such a great fighter and one of Armstrong's idols, he actually held the champion up for the last 4 rounds to allow him to see the final bell. A gesture that Ross appreciated deeply. Just 7 months after defeating P.T. Cerrone to win the featherweight title, Armstrong had won 13 fights since, scoring 12 knockouts, and become the welterweight champion of the world, defeating one of the greatest 147-pound fighters ever seen. Just 3 months later, he would immortalise himself in boxing history, having moved down to lightweight to take on the legendary Lou Ambers for the lightweight title. Ambers was one of the all-time great sluggers who had underrated defence for his era, and gave Armstrong one of the hardest fights of his career. Armstrong was dropped twice by Ambers and was bleeding so profusely that the referee even stated, "If you spit any more blood on the floor, I'm going to stop the fight." The damage that he received in this fight ultimately resulted in 37 stitches being needed. But history's most relentless fighter dug deep and eked out a split decision victory, becoming both the lightweight champion of the world and the only fighter in history to simultaneously hold 3 division titles. Now, it's important to understand the context of that 3 division titles in today's standards. Whilst 3 division champions are quite frequent now, despite it still being an incredible achievement, back in Armstrong's day, there were only 8 weight divisions in the sport, meaning he never won any of these titles in junior or super divisions. So it's the equivalent of holding 5 division titles all at the same time today. Immediately after the Ambers victory, Armstrong went about defending his welterweight crown, where over 22 months, he made a successful 19 defences over 15 round fights of the welterweight title, which is still, nearly a century later, the record in that division's history. Across these years, Armstrong defeated Hall of Famers in Pedro Montanez, Bobby Pacho, Ernie Roderick, Baby Arizmendi and Seferino Garcia. He also moved back down to lightweight to rematch Ambers in the defence of the title, which is the only loss he suffered in these years via split decision. But this was a contentious decision, and it's widely regarded that if Armstrong didn't lose 5 points due to fouls, he would have won that fight too. And what makes the Armstrong story even more impressive is his next step in his weight jumping glory. Having already defeated the Filipino great Seferino Garcia at welterweight, Garcia had gone on to become middleweight champion of the world, and Armstrong moved up to 160 pounds to challenge for that title. In the rematch, Armstrong comprehensively defeated Garcia once more, but this fight was controversially scored a draw in a fight that many deem as boxing's greatest ever robbery. Had he have got his deserved victory in the second fight against Garcia, he would have been the middleweight champion of the world and would have been a 4 division simultaneous champion in an era with just 8 weight divisions. Once again, to put that into modern context, it would be the equivalent of being a 7 division champion today, all at the same time. It's just unbelievable. At his best, Armstrong conquered half of the sport all at once. In an era where there were only 8 weight divisions, he obliterated 4, holding titles in 3 officially, all in which he cleared up in less than a year. In modern day, it's the equivalent of 7 divisions. He continuously battered all within his weight window, losing controversially just once to a man he'd already defeated across 61 fights. His record across his 3.5-year run in his prime was 59 wins, 1 defeat, 1 loss, with 51 staggering knockouts, and the draw was a robbery. He won 27 straight fights in 1937 alone, scoring 26 knockouts, amid a separate 27-fight knockout streak. Then, after all of this, successfully defended the titles by an all-time record-breaking margin in just 22 months. And those are the prime years that are the greatest I've ever heard about in the sport. Armstrong, at such a weight disadvantage, dominated half the sport with a style that was so aggressive. He was so often outsized by his opposition, but possessing a low guard and a bob and weave aggression, he planted his head against his opposition's chest and worked away at a relentless intensity that no one's ever been able to mimic. He got away with the fact he had a low guard by his ability to ride shots and smother his opposition. In his later years, it was discovered that he had an abnormally low heart rate and a heart size a third larger than the average human beings, a major contributing factor to his relentless work rate. He eventually lost the welterweight titles to one of the greatest, dirtiest fighters of all time, simultaneously in Fritzy Zivik. And by this point, he was seemingly past his best. And although he never boxed for the title again, he still notched up some incredible victories against Hall of Famers, gaining revenge against Zivik, whilst beating top names in Leo Rodak, Lou Jenkins, the Hall of Famer Sammy Angot, Willie Joyce and Tippy Larkin. He famously squared off against the young Sugar Ray Robinson later in his career. Armstrong is a prime example of overcoming adversity, fighting malnourished early on in his career and coming back to achieve legendary feats after a torrid beginning. He went on to dominate the sport in an unprecedented fashion that's never been matched since. His final career record was 151 wins, 21 defeats, 9 draws with 101 knockouts. After his career, he had already blown through his career fortunes in his 30s and had to overcome alcoholism. He became an ordained Baptist minister before passing away at the age of 75 in 1988. He defeated 11 different Hall of Famers 18 times, which is the third highest amount of Hall of Famers defeated in history, solely behind fellow 1930s great lightweight Jimmy McClarnin and the all-time great Harry Greb, tied alongside Sam Langford in separate Hall of Famers defeated. In the eyes of many, Armstrong is the greatest fighter that's ever lived, and at worst is in the top 2 of all time.